Hey there, flood insurance is an absolutely huge issue right now here in coastal Southwest Florida and Cape Coral, where I'm at right now. And really, if you're not up to speed on flood insurance and you're considering moving to anywhere in Southwest Florida, you're really at risk of losing thousands of dollars a year in flood insurance premiums that you may not have expected. And so in today's video, I'm going to kind of give you a rundown of the flood insurance issues here in Southwest Florida. I'm going to kind of give you what the basic flood zones are here. I'm going to tell you exactly how to search for a particular property's flood zone. And then I'm going to wrap everything up with some advice for you if you are considering a move down here, just so you have your expectations fully in place for what flood insurance will look like on any given property right here. So make sure you stay tuned for this video. A lot of great information in this. If you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Dustin Guthrie. I'm a longtime resident of Cape Coral in Southwest Florida. I've been a full-time real estate broker here for almost 20 years now. And I do a video like this on this channel every single week. I'm giving you a lot of really great, useful information in today's video. Sometimes we're just looking at some really fun real estate. And once a month, I also do a Cape Coral real estate market report, tons of statistics and really good information in those videos. So if you are considering a move to Southwest Florida or Cape Coral, or even if you live here now and you just kind of want to keep up to speed on everything, I want to invite you to hit that subscribe button so you can be around for these videos every week. I think you'll get a lot of really great, useful information in these videos. And if you are in the need for a realtor here anywhere in Southwest Florida, if you are buying or selling a property, I'm going to invite you to call, text, or email me. My contact information is right there on the screen there, and I would love to hear from you and hear about your individual real estate goals. But with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this flood insurance issue. It's very, very important these days here in Southwest Florida. All right, so why are we talking about flood insurance today? Why is it always in the news these days? It seems like, in years past, there was never really too much talk about flood insurance premiums being so expensive. And that has to mainly do with one thing. The vast majority of the flood insurance programs that we have here in coastal Southwest Florida are through FEMA in what is called the National Flood Insurance Program. That was a program put in place all the way back in 1968. And for years and years and years, it had been heavily subsidized. And as a result, the flood insurance premiums here were relatively inexpensive, maybe a few $100s, maybe up to $1,000 a year, which is really not too bad. But that all changed in late 2021. The National Flood Insurance Program underwent a big change in November of 2021 through what was called Risk Rating 2.0. It's also sometimes referred to as Flood 2.0. And what that basically did was it completely changed the risk ratings for flood insurance policies here for those National Flood Insurance Program policies. It eliminated basically all of the subsidies that we had previously enjoyed for those flood insurance policies. And so in many cases, once that change happened in late 2021, a flood insurance policy that was issued the day before the change may have been just a few $100s. And the day after that change was made, a brand new flood insurance policy went up by 3, 4, 5, 6 times what it may have been beforehand. So those subsidies went away, and that's why we're really talking about flood insurance these days. And so you really need to be paying attention to what a particular property's flood zone is and what sorts of insurance you can get when it comes to flood insurance for those particular types of properties. And you're usually limited, depending on the zone that you're in, to those National Flood Insurance Program policies. And they're still going to be usually the cheapest option for you, but you really need to be aware of what property that flood zone's in, and that's what we're going to get into next. So let me tell you about our different flood zones and where you can kind of find these online. All right, let's talk about the different types of flood zones that we have here. And I'm really specifically going to be talking about the city of Cape Coral. That's predominantly what I focus on in this channel. And really in the city of Cape Coral, we have 3 different types of flood zones. Now, I should mention that the entire city of Cape Coral is considered a flood zone technically. You may see some listings out there that say this property is not in the flood zone. Really what those are talking about is that property is not in the highest risk area flood zone. And so there are 3 different types. There's the low risk, there's the moderate risk, and there's the high risk. And each one of those has a code. And what we'll talk about first is the highest risk area. It's also called the special flood hazard area sometimes, but the code on it is AE. So when you're seeing listings out there that say this property is not in the flood zone, they're really saying that it's not in the special flood hazard area or the AE highest risk zone. And that zone is really where we're seeing the highest dollar premiums on an annual basis for those national flood insurance programs, policies, and oftentimes the private insurers won't even insure properties in that special flood hazard area. So generally speaking, that AE is kind of around the outside of the city, close to the coast. It represents a 1% annual chance of flooding. It's also sometimes referred to as the 100-year floodplain. So in other words, it has a 1% annual chance of flooding, and sometimes in a little bit excess of that. But the AE flood zone is where we're seeing the highest dollar premiums, especially for older properties. The absolute highest that we see are properties that were maybe built to a little bit lower elevation standards back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And as a result, especially if they are in that AE zone, you'll see some pretty significantly high insurance premiums on those properties. And we'll get into that here in just a second. But the three zones are the AE, the special flood hazard area. That's the highest risk. If you go down in risk a little bit, we have a moderate risk zone, which is also referred to as the X500. Now, I just got done talking about the AE as, generally speaking, a 1% chance or a 1 in 100-year chance of flooding. And when we go up to the X500, that represents between 0.2% and 1%. Sometimes it's referred to as within the 500-year floodplain. So in other words, you can expect if a property has a 0.2% annual chance of flooding, that property could probably see floodwater sometime within 500 years. Now, if we go further inland, we get to the lowest risk zone that we have here in the city of Cape Coral. That's called the X zone, and that's lower than a 0.2% annual chance of flooding. Obviously, that represents the cheapest insurance that you'll find. A lot of times you will find private insurers that will insure those properties. And I should mention, if a property is in the special flood hazard area, the vast majority of lenders are going to require you to have flood insurance. So if you go get a mortgage on a property that's in that special flood hazard area, in that AE zone, you're going to have to get flood insurance, and probably the only option that you're going to be able to get is that national flood insurance program. It's also, even if you do have private insurers that are willing to insure on that, normally the NFIP programs are going to be the cheapest option for you. Now, if you get into the X500, most lenders are not going to require you to have flood insurance on a property that's fully in that X500 zone. So if you're in that 0.2 to 1% chance of annual flooding risk, the lender's not going to require you to have flood insurance. It may be a good idea in your specific situation to go ahead and get that flood insurance, and it will often be a fair amount cheaper than the special flood hazard area properties, but most lenders are not going to require you to carry that flood insurance. And certainly if we get into the X zone, that's where we see the lowest cost premiums. Oftentimes the premiums are under $1,000 a year, maybe a few $100s a year, depending on the location and the age of the home. So X zone is the lowest risk area, X500, moderate risk. The AE, or special flood hazard area, that's really what we're most concerned about here in the city of Cape Coral. All right, so now you know a little bit about what the different flood zones are here in the city of Cape Coral in Southwest Florida. How do you make that determination whether a property is in the AE zone or if it's in the X500 or the low risk area in the full X zones? Well, the best way that you as the public can do that is through FEMA's actual website right here. And the actual website address itself is msc.fema.gov/portal/search. I'm going to link that down in the description of this video, but really if you just go to Google and enter FEMA flood zone search, this website will be one of the first things that pops up. And when you click on that site and go to it, this is what you're going to see right here. It's basically a picture of the United States and a search bar up there. And you really have to search these by individual addresses. So if you are shopping for a property, if you're on Zillow or something, you're looking at various listings, you got something that maybe you're interested in and you want to learn whether that property is in the AE, the X500, or the X zone, just plug that address into the search bar up here. And this is the example property I'm using. This is a waterfront property here in Cape Coral. And when you click search, it'll zoom in on the map right here, and you'll notice this different color coding right here. In this particular FEMA map, the AE flood zone, the special flood hazard area, is that teal sort of light blue color. And then this particular map doesn't differentiate between X500 and full-on X. It just says whether or not it's in the X zone. So anything that you're seeing in dark orange there is going to be X500 or X. In this case, just because I know where this property is over there, all of that orange area right there is actually X500. So again, X500, 0.2% annual chance of flooding. The teal zone here, the AE flood zone, that's a 1% or sometimes a little bit more than 1% risk of annual flood damage happening there. So let's take a look at this specific property, because I wanted to share this with you because it's a really useful example right here. As we zoom in on this, okay, we've got basically all the structures of these homes on this street right here are in that dark orange, which means they're in the X500 zone. So what probably happened here was years back when they built these houses, they maybe brought in enough fill dirt to bring in the actual structure of the house just up above where that AE flood zone kind of cuts off. And as a result, you're seeing the structures of these homes in that orange area or the X500 zone. When you get over into the street and the front yards and obviously the backyards and down by where the water is, that is all the AE flood zone. But this particular property is a useful example because if we zoom in on this, kind of notice up there in that upper right corner of that property. So we've got that corner sort of sticking out into that AE flood zone. What's probably going to happen is if you went to get a mortgage on this property, let's say you put it under contract and you went to get a mortgage, that lender is going to reach out to an insurance agent, and that insurance agent is going to do a manual review of whether or not this property is in the flood zone. And when they do those manual reviews, they're going to see that the corner of that property is sticking out into that AE flood zone, and that probably means they're going to classify this property as being in the AE flood zone, and they're going to make you have flood insurance on it, and that flood insurance is going to be a little bit more expensive. So even though the vast majority of the structure of this house is technically in that X500 zone, that moderate risk area, because that little corner is sticking out there, probably going to be having to get flood insurance on this property, and it's probably going to be a little bit more expensive. We're seeing these situations kind of pop up because they did kind of adjust the flood maps a little bit back in late 2022. And so for folks that have owned the home for a long time, they may have in years past always been in that X500 zone or X zone, and maybe their lender is not requiring them to have flood insurance. But when they kind of adjusted those little barriers, those borders of that flood zone, they've got that corner kind of stuck in there now. And so a new buyer going in there getting a loan on this property is probably going to now have to have flood insurance on it. Now there are ways, and we don't really need to get into all of that mess right now, there are ways to go in there and get maybe an elevation certificate on this property and send that into FEMA, proving that the structure and the adjacent grade next to the building is in fact high enough to get this property completely out of that AE flood zone and into the X500. That's sometimes called a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision. I'm not going to get into all that on this video, but it is something to keep in the back of your mind. If you do come across a situation like this, there may be an opportunity to come in there and get a new elevation certificate and actually get this property reclassified into being totally outside of that AE flood zone. And as a result, then you wouldn't have to have flood insurance on this property, even if you got a mortgage on it. Or as a result, your flood insurance is probably going to go down significantly. So that's something just to keep in the back of your mind. But this website is really useful. It's really the only publicly available map search like this. We've got one as realtors that we can use. It's kind of behind our paywall there. And ours is a little bit more user-friendly than this one. This one's kind of bulky, like most things in the federal government, I would imagine. But nevertheless, it is a useful tool if you are searching through these properties yourself. If you're especially going on Zillow or something like that and looking at properties, you can plug that address right into this website and it will get you this map, and you can see exactly what that flood zone looks like and whether that property is again in the AE special flood hazard area or if it's in the moderate risk X500 or low risk X zone. So useful tool. I'm going to link it. I'm going to put the link down in the description of this video. All right, so let's talk about the cost of these flood insurance policies and the coverage amount. So when we're talking about these NFIP, these National Flood Insurance Program flood policies, first thing you need to be aware of is there's a cap as to how much coverage you can actually have on these particular flood insurance policies. And that cap is $250,000 of flood coverage. So in other words, if you did have a flood insurance policy through the NFIP, if that home were to be flooded. The flood damage specifically that's covered under that insurance policy would cap out at $250,000. And usually, especially in the city of Cape Coral, the flooding that we did see for the properties, the few properties that did get flood damage back during Hurricane Ian, you wouldn't necessarily meet that threshold of $250,000. A lot of these homes got maybe 2 or 3 inches of water in them, so you're talking about taking out the drywall, maybe replacing some cabinets, kitchen cabinets and flooring and things like that. So usually $250,000 would be enough specifically for the flood damage that you might see here in the city of Cape Coral. It's certainly not going to be enough to cover what they experienced out there on the barrier islands during Hurricane Ian, when they had a 15-foot storm surge come through and basically demolished the house. But just be aware, you are going to get capped at $250,000 of structural coverage, and then you can get optional coverage up to $100,000 for contents. So in other words, your furnishings, jewelry, whatever you have inside the house that's not really attached to the property. So that's your caps on it. And when it comes to some of these NFIP policy amounts, you can see where it sometimes doesn't make sense, if you do own these homes cash, to have flood insurance, to have those policies. If you're talking about a flood insurance policy that might cost $8,000 or $9,000 a year and you're only getting $250,000 of coverage, that's why you see some people who own their homes cash elect to self-insure versus paying that money out every year. And, it's up to your individual situation whether or not you're willing to take on that risk or not. I'm certainly not advocating one way or the other for that. But just keep in mind that those policies do cap out at $250,000. In terms of the cost that we're seeing, and again, there's just a lot of variables that go into the cost of specific flood insurance policies. When we're talking about the AE flood zone, the special flood hazard area, I've seen policies cost as little as $2,500 a year, sometimes maybe even a little bit less than that. It's usually somewhere, the bottom is usually somewhere $2,000 to $2,500 a year. And then I've certainly seen policies get in excess of $10,000. It really has to do with the specific area the property is in and the age of the home. So as you can imagine, back in the 50s and the 60s, the elevation standards that builders were required to meet back then were much lower elevations than they're required to meet right now for a brand new construction home. So even in the AE flood zone, if you've got a brand new construction homes, you're probably going to be closer to that $2,500, $3,000 maybe a year, depending on where the property is. If you've got a home that was built in 1955 and it's right on the river here in the city of Cape Coral in that AE flood zone, that's when we're seeing those policies get up north of $8,000, $9,000 a year in some cases. Generally speaking, for an AE, let's call it a Gulf access home, I just did one, 1975 built house, direct Gulf access, 5 minutes out to open water by boat, so you're right there near the coast. We just got a brand new National Flood Insurance Program quote for that. It was about $4,100 a year, and that's a little more typical. So if you're trying to plan out, you really ought to have an insurance agent just kind of check it for you so they can give you exactly what you can expect. But generally speaking, we're seeing somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for a lot of these properties. But again, it depends on the age, depends on exactly the location. But for these AE flood zone policies, usually it falls between that $3,000, maybe $5,000 a year. And again, that's just for $250,000 of structural coverage. If you want to get that extra $100,000 in contents coverage, it can tick up a little bit north of that. But that's generally the average that I'm seeing, at least in my business right now. It certainly can get up higher than that, and certainly if a property's newer built, it could maybe tick under that $3,000. But generally speaking, somewhere $3,000 to $5,000 depending on where you're at. And if it is a little bit older and closer to open water, you can probably plan on it being a little bit more than that. Now, one thing I should mention for these AE policies, for these AE flood zone policies, is if a property owner had a National Flood Insurance Program policy before that change was made that I mentioned at the beginning of this video in 2021, before that Risk 2.0 came out, they didn't make those people's premiums go up that much overnight. Your flood insurance premiums are capped at a maximum increase of 18% per year. They can't ever raise your rate more than 18% per year. So in some cases, if these people have had flood insurance ever since maybe 2003 or something like that, and they were paying $700 a year for flood insurance prior to that change in 2021, they could only take that up 18% per year ever since then. And if you're somebody who's looking at purchasing a property here, if you're buying it from somebody that has one of those old grandfathered policies, you can oftentimes assume that policy at the lower rate. So you might be able to take that flood insurance policy over at $1,000 a year, $1,200 a year, whereas if you had to get a brand new policy on it, it might be $4,000 a year. Just be aware that that policy is more than likely going to increase that maximum of 18% per year until you get to those current rates. So there's some ways that you can kind of navigate these more expensive flood insurance policies. And we can certainly talk to you about that if you want to give me a call. I'll be happy to go into that in more detail with you. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on that in this particular video. But in terms of the X500 or the X zone properties, what you can anticipate to pay for flood insurance there, well, you get into the X500 and the X zone properties, and that usually opens it up to some more private insurers. So you can maybe get more coverage than that $250,000 of max coverage that you would see with the NFIP programs. Now, it's kind of give or take. We're seeing more of these private insurers kind of get into this market here a little bit, and I was actually surprised the other day to find a private policy that was actually a little bit less than the National Flood Insurance Program policy amount, and that was kind of a first for me. So, you know, it's really just comes down to getting a really good insurance agent. I would strongly recommend a local insurance agent who kind of deals with these policies day in and day out. They kind of know what to expect and kind of can guide you in the right direction. And if you need somebody, I've got some really, really great insurance agents here locally in the city of Cape Coral, and they can certainly help you out. I'd be happy to put you in touch with those folks. But general costs for the X500 properties, you know, you're probably going to be usually less than $2,500 a year, maybe less than $2,000 a year. Full X zone properties, oftentimes you're probably going to be less than maybe $1,500 a year, $1,200 a year. Again, it just depends on the age of the home. It depends on the specific location and maybe what that individual property's elevation certificate says on it, because we do have, especially some of the newer construction properties that are going in here, some of these builders are able to bring in a little bit more fill dirt and actually raise those properties up fully out of the AE flood zone into the X500. And in those situations, not only do you not have to have flood insurance if you don't want it, even if you're getting a mortgage on it, those flood insurance premium rates are going to be significantly less than they otherwise would be if that property was in the solid AE special flood hazard area. So I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of dancing around the numbers a little bit with you, but it varies so much property to property. But the big thing is older properties closer to open water are going to have the highest premium amounts. Newer properties and properties that are maybe a little bit farther from open water, maybe in that, especially if they're in the X500 or the X zone, that's where you're going to see the lowest flood insurance premiums. And that's kind of the long and short of things. All right, so what advice can I give you as you're trying to navigate this complex situation that is flood insurance here in coastal Southwest Florida? The biggest advice that I can give you is just get in touch with a local insurance agent that's been in the business a long time. Again, I've got some really great contacts. If you need somebody, I'd be more than happy to put you in touch with those folks. But it's really important that you get a local insurance agent because they're the ones that are most familiar with the situation down here. They write these policies all the time, and they're going to be able to give you kind of an indication of what you're going to be paying on a particular property, whether it's through the National Flood Insurance Program, like most of the special flood hazard area properties are going to be, or in some cases, these agents are able to find some private insurers where you can get maybe a little bit more coverage. And maybe in some cases, like I mentioned, I just saw recently where a private insurer was coming in at a lower cost than the National Flood Insurance Program. That was really the first time I had seen that. So I think they are making some progress here locally on the flood insurance issue. In terms of expectations while you're just shopping around, keep in mind if you're looking at, especially like for Gulf access homes, if you're looking at a direct Gulf access property, the vast majority of those are going to be in the AE flood zone. And so if you're looking at those properties and you're seeing a house that was maybe built in the 60s or the 1970s, particularly down in like the extreme southeast section of Cape Coral, that's what we call the Yacht Club neighborhood. That's where we saw a lot of the damage happen, the flood damage from Hurricane Ian back in late 2022. And it's mainly because those properties were mostly older properties. They were 50s, 60s, 70s built homes, and because they were built to lower elevation standards, they are the ones where we saw the most flood damage, and as a result, they're also the ones where we see the highest insurance premiums. So big thing is the age of the home. Keep in mind that the older the home is, the more likely, the more expensive the flood insurance policy is going to be for that home. Again, because it comes down to the elevation standards that they had back then versus now. I still haven't come across a property that was built since 2000 that saw flood damage in Hurricane Ian. That doesn't mean they're not out there, I'm not saying that. But me personally, I haven't seen one just yet. So if you have seen one, and maybe write me in the comments where you were, because I'd be interested to see that. But most of the flood damage that we saw were the 1960s, 1970s, 1950s homes that were built to those lower elevation standards. But really, more than anything, find out what floods, use the tool that I gave you, the website, to kind of search whether or not a particular property is in the AE flood zone or if it's in the X500 or X zone. But beyond that, the most important thing, especially if you're purchasing a property within that inspection period, it's a good idea just to reach out to an insurance agent, say, hey, I'm buying this property, can you please run me a flood insurance quote on this, just so you can see exactly what that's going to look like, and you're not blindsided after the fact by a flood insurance policy that was maybe $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 more than you anticipated. So biggest piece of advice, if you can buy a newer property, buy a newer property. It's going to be more expensive for you, but in terms of the flood insurance, it's usually going to be a lot less on an annual basis. But more than anything, just while you're doing your due diligence, talk to a local insurance agent who really knows what they're talking about, and get yourself a flood quote on that particular property, just so you can be prepared for exactly what you're getting into when it comes to flood insurance on that particular property. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this particular video. I know this was kind of a really quick video, but hopefully it was chock full of some great information that maybe you weren't already aware of when it comes to flood insurance here in Southwest Florida. And hopefully you got something out of this video. If you did, do me a favor, hit the like button for me. It just helps me out and helps the channel out. And also, if you're not subscribed to this channel, especially if you did get some useful information out of this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I'm usually giving you a lot of really great information on various topics here in Southwest Florida. Again, sometimes we're talking about maybe some new construction, new commercial developments that are coming to the area. Sometimes we're looking at some really nice real estate. And of course, I do the monthly real estate market update report every single month. So I think, especially if you are somebody who's considering moving to Cape Coral or moving to Southwest Florida, or like I said, even if you live here now and you just kind of want to keep up to speed on everything, make sure you subscribe. I'd love to have you on as a subscriber, and I think you'll get a lot out of these videos every single week. But beyond that, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate your time. If I can help you with anything, call, text, or email me. My number's right there on the screen, as is my email, and I would absolutely love to hear from you and tell you a little bit about how I can help you out with your real estate goals here in Southwest Florida. But thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next video here in just a few days.
Like and subscribe. Just kidding.